You're listening to The Nourished Child, episode number 98. Today on the show I have Bettina Siegel, author of the new book, Kid Food, and blogger at The Lunch Tray. Today we discuss the reality of highly processed food, otherwise known as kid food, and how pervasive it is in our kids' worlds today, making it a challenging feat for any parent to navigate raising healthy eaters. From food marketing to picky eaters, school lunches, and political motivations in our nation's capital, we talk about it all. You're in for a treat and an eye-opener. Bettina Siegel is a mom of two and a nationally recognized writer and advocate on issues relating to children and food policy. A graduate of Yale College and Harvard Law School, Bettina practiced intellectual property, advertising, and food law in New York City for almost a decade before turning to a career in freelance writing. In early 2010, she became interested in improving the food in her children's school district, the Houston ISD, and soon after launched The Lunch Tray, a blog about all things related to kids and food in school and out. We're talking about her very first book, Kid Food, The Challenge of Feeding Children in a Highly Processed World. It was recently published, and you can find it on Amazon and any other place that sells books. Today's show notes are over on jillcastle.com/098. That's 098 for episode number 98. And now it's time to cue the music.
Welcome to the Nourished Child Podcast, a show about childhood nutrition, feeding kids, and dealing with the ups and downs of growing a healthy child. Here's your host, registered dietitian and childhood nutrition expert, Jill Castle.
Hey everyone, welcome back to The Nourished Child. It's a podcast about child nutrition, feeding kids, and dealing with the ups and downs of raising them. I'm Jill Castle, your host. If this is your first time to listen in, welcome, welcome. If you're a returning listener, I'm glad to have you back. As we head into the holiday season, I wanted to take a moment to wish you and yours a very happy, relaxing season. I really hope you take what you need from this season, whether it be a break from cooking or an uptick in being social and going to social gatherings, or even if you just need some alone time to journal, read, or even take a nap. Whatever it is you feel you need, I encourage you to honor yourself, especially during the season of giving. We often forget to put ourselves on the list of receivers. Okay, just a few quick announcements before we get on with the show. If you are out shopping for holiday gifts for the season for a little one in your life, I just published a blog post article over on my blog called 50 Children's Books About Nutrition. So I collected recommendations from followers on my Facebook page. I compiled some of the authors I've interviewed here before in that list, as well as some of the books that I've read myself. So if you are looking for a book about nutrition for a child to read, you can see over there on my website, www.jillcastle.com/blog, you'll be able to see an article called 50 Children's Books About Nutrition. It's just a listing of all the different books, things like Green Eggs and Ham, just all kinds of different children's books that talk about food or talk about nutrition in a pressure-free, entertaining way. So I hope that is useful to you. Another announcement, my workbook called Try New Food will be out as an ebook option very soon, hopefully this month in December. For those of you who prefer a digital book, I've got you covered. You won't be able to do the written exercises within the ebook, but you will be able to journal on the side with your own notebook or jot down notes if you like. You'll be able to find that ebook alongside the print book over on Amazon. Just type in the search box, Try New Food, and that book will pop up for you. Again, it should be available sometime in December, but definitely by the first of the year. And then last, all healthcare professionals out there who listen to this show, I just wanted to give a quick announcement. My Thrive Mastermind is opening up for applications today. If you are interested in a 6-month hyper-focused business, education, program, mentorship, and group mastermind, I invite you to check out this program. We start January 16th. And applications to join are open until January 9th. You can check the show notes for all the details. I'll include the links there so you can find out more about the program. Other than that, let us get into the show with Bettina, author of Kid Food. Hi, Bettina. Welcome to the Nourished Child podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's great to have you. I feel like this is almost as good as meeting you in person.
Which I've long wanted to do. I hope we do get to meet in person at some point.
I do too. Thanks so much for coming on the show to talk about your brand new book, Kid Food, which just came out. And I had such a great time reading it. I'm actually going to reread it because I want to read every single word that's in there. But before we start talking about the book and Kid Food and what the book is all about, why don't you start by telling the audience who you are, your background, and how you got into advocacy around kids' food?
Yes, I'd be glad to. I don't really have the expected background for this kind of book. I'm not like a master's in public health or a dietitian or anything like that. I kind of fell into it accidentally. I'm trained as a lawyer, and not only that, I actually used to work for Big Food for part of my legal career. But then I eventually stopped practicing law. I was a stay-at-home mom. We moved to Houston. I got asked to come to a meeting that my school district was pulling together to get parents' input about school food menus. And I learned so much interesting stuff in that meeting. And it just made me want to learn more about the National School Lunch Program, which I then did. And then I was just kind of brimming with information and thoughts about it that I wanted to share. And since at that time I was also doing some freelance writing, I started a blog called The Lunch Tray in 2010, which wasn't just about school food, isn't just about school food. It's really anything relating to children and food in school or out.
Awesome. It's a great blog. And listeners out there, if you have not come across The Lunch Tray, you definitely need to go and check it out. I'll include those links in the show notes. But let's dig into what kid food is exactly, because you do a really good job in the book of explaining what it is. But I'm not exactly sure that the listeners will know entirely what you mean.
Right. That was one of the first challenges I faced in writing the book, which what do we mean by kid food? So I actually polled my social media following, and about 350 people responded. And I also looked at grocery products that are marketed either directly to children or to parents as being somehow especially suitable for children. And what emerges is this picture. And again, I think to some extent we all kind of know it when we see it, like restaurant children's menu food, chicken nuggets and mac and cheese and pizza and French fries and things like that. But of course, adults eat foods like that too. In terms of the grocery products, what we call kid food, or what the industry would like us to think is kid food, tends to be food that's marketed almost as a form of entertainment. So there's often the use of cartoon characters and games, or the food itself is something kids can kind of manipulate. There's almost always like an unusual shape or a really bright color or unusual colors, that we don't find in nature. So all of that together, I think, forms the universe of what we call kid food in today's society. What's really interesting, though, is it is an entirely artificial construct. And one of the things I did when I dove into the research was to look at what was considered kid food when restaurant menus first appeared, which was back in the 1920s. And it was an entirely different and much healthier view of what kid food was. Back then, there were just different notions about how we should feed children. And it was, kids were thought to need like especially delicate food and simple food and lots of dairy. So it was just a very different view of how to feed kids.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I found that part of the book really interesting because I myself had never looked deep back into that. And it was interesting to hear you talk about Ethel Colson, who was one of the original, I think she was a journalist, right?
That's right. That's right. So it was really interesting to even learn, why did children's menus suddenly appear in the 1920s? And the answer really surprised me. It was actually a response to prohibition. Before that, apparently, restaurants really did not want you to bring your kids. And actually, culturally, most parents probably wouldn't even think to bring their kids to a fancy restaurant. But after Prohibition, the restaurant industry was really hurting. They couldn't sell alcohol anymore. And there was also more competition because bars were now starting to sell food because they couldn't sell alcohol. And so they saw an opportunity. But I think a real pioneer, a person who really got that idea on their radar, was this journalist named Ethel Colson. And she wrote an editorial in a trade magazine in 1920 called The American Restaurant. And the title of her editorial was, why not children's luncheon? And she sort of laid out for the restaurant industry, listen, there's a real market opportunity here for you if you could offer special meals for children, maybe even with a little toy, so she was very ahead of her time. And I think that really did capture the industry's attention.
And it was just from there to where we are today has just evolved over time. And it's quite different today, from the types of foods that are offered to children to kids menus even. I mean, I know that's a hot topic for a lot of parents, why the food on the kid menu is so unhealthy. And I know a lot of parents have trouble navigating that. But one of the things that you highlight in the book is this unifying characteristic across all kid food categories, which you say is the promise of fun. So let's talk about that and unpack that a little bit.
Well, what's troubling about it, I mean, it's not that, we all, I think, look for some, food should be pleasurable. And when we go out to eat, we want our food to look appealing and taste good. And similarly with the meals we cook at home. But there's something about this, the way the industry promotes kid food. It's very much to kind of lure kids' attention, part and parcel of their entire marketing toward children, which is quite aggressive, as I describe in the book. I mean, $2 billion a year are spent collectively by the food and beverage industries to market their products just to children. And the nature of those foods is part and parcel of that marketing. And the reason why it's troubling is when kids are so habituated to their food being in fun shapes and bright colors and having Dora or Scooby-Doo on them, it does tend to, make them whine for those foods, demand those foods from their parents, which is in and of itself a marketing strategy. It's called pester power. And then also the concern, I think, is that it really can lure children away from healthier food, which starts to seem very boring by comparison, both visually, but also it lacks that kind of hyper palatability of highly processed food or restaurant food or fast food. And it can just make healthy, wholesome food a harder sell for parents. So I think that's another, troubling aspect of this.
Mm-hmm. And I think you did a really good job in the book, really outlining all the different obstacles that get in the way of parents being able to raise healthy eaters. And it's funny, on my Facebook page, The Nourished Child, I asked, what would you want me to ask Bettina, on the interview? And somebody said, I want to know how to get my child to eat more green vegetables. And I thought, my initial reaction was, this is not really a book to teach you how to get your child to eat vegetables. However, it is a book that really outlines every obstacle in your way that is contributing to the fact that your child doesn't want to eat vegetables.
Exactly. I think sometimes when people see the title of the book, they assume that I'm going to offer them, really concrete, picky eating advice. And I'm thinking, no, that's what you're for, Jill, and I refer people, in my appendix to the true experts who can help them with those conundrums. But yes, exactly. I'm trying to talk about what's going on in the larger food environment that is making that job extremely difficult for you. And I do address picky eating in the book, the science of it, the science of early taste formation, because I do think picky eating plays a real role in this construct we have of kid food, because we've all, I think, or many of us have sort of bought into the notion that there's something about kids that makes them inherently less likely to embrace healthier food. And then that leads us often down the path of highly processed, quote unquote, kid food, because it just feels like the easier way to go.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, you really outline in that chapter several contributing factors around picky eating that sort of lead children down this avenue of reinforced picky eating. We could probably talk a little bit more about that, in that I don't think parents really realize that food preferences are established, most of them, up to 90% of them, by age 5. after that, it can be very difficult to entice a child to eat the foods that they've not been exposed to or haven't had enough exposure to even.
Exactly. I mean, I really, as a parent of a child who I labeled as picky in my own mind and really now, question that learning all of the science about the early formation of taste preferences was so illuminating to me. And I often think, if readers get nothing else out of this book, if you are a parent, of a young child, a baby or early toddler, I hope this information is helpful to you. It's information I wish I'd had. For example, as I'm sure you know, there's a period in infancy when children are particularly receptive to new flavors, and parents can actually, consciously try to maximize that period. It's called the flavor window, to try to establish a broader palate down the road. And then also the other thing I didn't know is that there is a almost guaranteed period in which toddlers are going to exhibit what's called food neophobia. I mean, a sudden sort of reluctance to try new foods. And if I'd known that was coming, I would have approached my son's behavior very differently. I would have said, oh, this is just that bump in the road they told me was going to come, down the pike. And instead, I didn't know what to make of it except to conclude, oh no, I've got this picky eater. And then I think that shaped how I fed him for the worse, which is really something I regret now.
And I think that's very common for lots of parents. And it even goes back further to the fact that we don't do our parents any favors by leaving them out in the cold. The minute they have a child, we just don't do a good job of preparing them for feeding their children and for the nutritional needs and requirements and demands of the day-to-day. And without that preparation, what to expect, I think a lot of parents are out there scrambling, trying to figure it out as they go along.
Absolutely. And then the other thing that I do talk about in the book is the degree to which the processed food industry knows that we've got these concerns and lack of information and worries about mealtime. And then it sells itself as a solution to the problem, when in fact, if you start relying too heavily on these highly processed products, you may be exacerbating the problem, because children very quickly adapt to those products, and it can make healthier food a harder sell. So, one example I gave in the book, and this ad campaign came out when my manuscript was complete, and I called the publisher and I was like, we've got to, squeeze this in, because it was such a good example of this phenomenon, was a campaign by Kraft to promote both its shredded cheese and its mac and cheese. And they literally show a series of ads of parents putting down a healthy meal on the table. And then the kid makes this sort of gagging, reaction, and then they switch over to the mac and cheese. And I just thought that encapsulates this problem that, they know that we're struggling, and then they offer themselves as a solution, but it's a really questionable one.
Right. I saw those ads. That was great that you could get it into the book. Let's talk a little bit about advertising and marketing, and I want to dive into this a little bit deeper, because I think that parents might not really fully understand the messaging and the promises that are made by food marketing. And I have to say, in full disclosure, my husband's in advertising. Thank goodness it's not in food advertising. It would be very hard for us, but I understand advertising and marketing by nature of being married to somebody who's in this business day in and day out. But let's talk about, you go through, 8 or 9 different messages, and I want to sort of pepper back and popcorn with you about what each of these mean and what their underlying intent is. So are you ready to do this with me?
Yes, let's do it.
Okay. We can get food into your kid.
Right. So this is just the most basic pitch. It's not so sophisticated or particularly devious, but it's the sort of ads where, they'll say like Tyson chicken nuggets, it's the food your kid will never say no to, that kind of thing. You just want to get your kids fed, and they know that, and they're playing into it.
Got it. Our food will buy you some peace and quiet.
So this, I think, is really interesting. I think we have seen a change in parenting styles. I think we're all maybe more permissive than prior generations. I think some of us have a little trouble disciplining our children at mealtime, or don't even want to, because we don't want to, rock the boat at this time that the family's together. There are literally ads that I put in the book that talk about how the mac and cheese or the KFC will lead to quiet at the table, which I found really fascinating.
Okay. Abandon hope. Your kid will never accept healthier food.
So I think the Kraft ad we just talked about is an excellent example, and I offer several others in the book. The company sells to you the notion just give up. They're never going to accept healthier food. But don't worry, we're here for you, that kind of thing.
Right. Our packaging is tasteful, so our product must be healthy.
So the example I give here are Cheez-It crackers. Imagine that bright red box. It usually has a cartoon character on it, like the latest, hot cartoon character. It just kind of screams big food to you. But if you see that same exact product at Whole Foods packaged, in a beige box and the brand is Back to Nature, you might feel very differently about giving that product to your kid. And yet if you analyze the ingredients, they are almost exactly the same. So that's I call that like beige washing.
Our product is sort of healthy.
It's very easy to get misled by these claims that are literally true, but kind of give a product more of a health halo than it deserves. So a really good example is made with real fruit, which on its face sounds like the product is healthier than if it weren't made with real fruit. But that legally can actually refer to just a fruit puree concentrate, which in and of itself is a form of added sugar. So it really does not mean the product is healthier. And yet it's so easy to see why parents are confused by that kind of made with claim.
Mm-hmm. We can sneak veggies into your kid.
As I'm sure parents are aware, there are lots of products on the market now that claim to give your kid kind of the equivalent of sitting down to eating vegetables in particular, or sometimes fruits. So a really kind of troubling use of this kind of claim is in the area of toddler snacks. They know you're worried your child isn't eating enough vegetables. And so they'll package, puffs or crackers, and they'll say, made with kale or contains spinach. And it gives you this feeling of reassurance. But if you really drill down, essentially you're giving your child usually the equivalent of like a potato starch chip.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, some of these are so sneaky. Our sugary drink is pediatrician approved.
Right. So this pertains to a particular product category that I really dive into a little bit in the book because the marketing for it is so egregious. And what I'm talking about here are toddler milks, and they're sometimes called toddler drinks or growing up milks. And just the short version is these are products that really have no place in a child's diet. They're not necessary. They're sugar sweetened. And yet the marketing for them can easily lead parents to believe that they're actually a necessary or beneficial thing to give your child.
Yeah. Did you see that Wall Street Journal article that came out maybe like just a couple of weeks ago?
Tell me, which one?
It was about toddler milks and toddler food. And it had some quotes and interviews with the Yukon Red food marketing group. It's an interesting article. I ended up posting that link on my Facebook page, and several people were very upset about calling out toddler drinks as having added sugar to them. They were really offended by it. So I thought that was so interesting. So many people were of the mindset, this is what we have to feed our child. Our child will not eat anything else or drink anything else. It was very interesting.
Yes, I know. Now I know the article you mean. It was in the Washington Post. I saw it too. And right, that's another kind of very insidious form of marketing for these products in particular. They will very overtly talk about how toddlers are picky eaters and that this drink can give you some nutritional reassurance. But really what this is, vegetable oil, powdered milk, sugar, and fortified vitamins and minerals. And every picky eating expert I talked to was adamant that this can actually exacerbate picky eating because you're just at the time your child should be expanding their, repertoire of foods, you're giving them this sort of sugary, satiating beverage. And it's really not the way to go about trying to, help your child along in terms of picky eating and adapting to healthier food.
Yeah. I mean, just as a side note, that is not my first route of nourishment for toddlers, even if they are picky. And if it does end up being something like that comes on board, there's an exit strategy. There's a time limited exit strategy. Just like you said, children can get hooked on these. They can be a slippery slope. Okay.
Absolutely.
2 more. Studies say our product is healthy, or studies are junk science.
Right. So what that pertains to is what I call nutritional noise, which is a variety of different ways that I run through quickly in the book of how, even apart from the claims you're looking at on the product in the supermarket that can be very confusing / misleading, the food industry is doing lots of things in the background that also confuse us about what is healthy for us. And one way they do that that's quite effective is they fund their own studies of their products. Marion Nestle from NYU has an entire book on this now called Unsavory Truth. And the bottom line is, surprise, surprise, when the industry funds its own study, it almost always supports whatever health claim they want to make for their product. Similarly, the flip side, when independent studies come out that might criticize a certain product, like sugary beverages, the industry and its spokespeople will be very quick to say, well, that's just junk science, or that's not, there are no firm conclusions about that. And so all of that nutritional noise is in the background, making it even harder for us all to figure out, well, what really is healthy for my family?
Mm-hmm. And just to ask you, what would you say to the comment that I often hear that, science wouldn't happen unless there was funding by industry behind it?
Well, I think when it's something like, Welch's grape juice, Welch is funding a study to tell us that Concord grapes support cognitive, benefits. It's clearly a marketing ploy. I'm not sure that's research we needed. Do you know what I'm saying? So I'm not sure I necessarily buy into that, because these tend to be sort of small bore studies that are really designed just to support marketing claims.
Gotcha. Okay. And the last one, I was like, am I putting this in or am I not putting this in? It's dietitian approved.
Right. And so this is obviously very sensitive. I know many registered dietitians, present company included, who are incredibly responsible and would never promote a product that, would run counter to their clients' health or the public's health. But there are some examples. For example, in the book, there's a dietitian who wrote a column equating a small can of Diet Coke as a snack that compared to a handful of almonds. In other words, they were equally acceptable. So we obviously know that's not really true. And she, of course, was paid by Coca-Cola. So the good news is, my understanding, and you could probably comment on this too, is that is far less common these days. I know there's been an effort within the dietetics field to really kind of discourage that kind of partnership and to keep corporate influence out of conferences now, and, really try to improve that situation. But it does still exist. And not just dietitians, but other influencers as well. Like the food and beverage industries, really like to attract social media influencers, those moms on Instagram with, hundreds of thousands of followers, because they know that we are likely to follow whatever they recommend. And so that's just another way that the nutritional noise volume goes up.
Yeah. Parents out there that are listening, or I'm feeling the heaviness of this myself right now as we talk about it. This is heavy stuff. This is a lot it feels like there's just a lot to overcome just in the marketing approaches around kids' food for families.
Absolutely. One of the reasons why I wrote Kid Food is because I wanted just first and foremost to validate parents. Like, if you are feeling like you are having a tough time raising a healthy eater, despite your best intentions, you're not crazy. It is really hard. And so but I didn't want to just lament the state of affairs. I really wanted to help educate parents, like at every step of the way. Here's why it's so hard, because I think that's the first step toward change. And I also wanted to, empower parents, to give them the tools, for example, like we were just talking about, to kind of see through marketing claims, to be a better consumer, because I'm going to help you with some information that I can provide.
Today's episode is brought to you by Try New Food, how to help new eaters, picky eaters, and extreme picky eaters taste, eat, and like new food. If you have a picky eater on your hands, I know it's not easy. While you might think the answer to your situation is in offering more veggies to your child, it most likely isn't the approach that will be most effective and nurturing for your child. In my book, Try New Food, I give you the approach that preserves your loving relationship while gently nudging your child with repeated exposure to food, positive feeding interactions, and finding courage and adventure at the meal table. Go to www.jillcastle.com/books to grab your copy of Try New Food and start helping your child taste, eat, and like new food. Educate me and our listeners as to what is carnival food and how is it showing up in schools?
So carnival food is the term that you often hear in this context for menus that are very quote unquote kid food heavy. So you look at the week's menu and it's like cheese pizza one day, hamburgers the next, nachos the next, that kind of thing, where there's no effort made to try to move kids along a bit, expand their palates, and, offer meals that might be a little more adventurous, a little more, relying on fresh food as opposed to highly processed packaged food, that kind of thing. There are many reasons why we see carnival food menus. And I should pause here and say, I do think the trend is moving in the right direction. And there are districts around the country that are really doing a good job, kind of, as I said, kind of pushing kids along. But as I describe in the one chapter in the book about school food, we've placed so many obstacles and challenges in the way of school nutrition professionals that just purely for financial reasons, they find themselves pushed in the direction toward carnival food. And, not to get too in the weeds, but they very much rely on participation. They need to get kids into the program and in the door. And of course, it's much easier to do that with carnival food than anything that's remotely unfamiliar to children. And then also for funding reasons, infrastructure reasons, labor market reasons, they may not have the ability to scratch cook. They just simply may not be able to do it. And that's another factor that pushes schools toward that kind of menu.
So when you say they are relying on participation, you're meaning that their budget, based on how many actually come through the line?
Right. The government funding, we can just start there, is insufficient. It's not, if you want to see the kind of scratch cooked, healthful meals that I think most parents would like to see, I can just state unequivocally, we are not giving districts enough funding to do that with any kind of ease. The districts that are pulling that off, sometimes they're getting outside funding. They get grants, they get, other kinds of assistance. We're just not making it feasible for districts nationwide to be serving that kind of meal.
Mm-hmm. It sounds like there's a lot of politics behind all of kid food that we've talked about so far: school nutrition, marketing. You do dig into the politics and policy, and we could get into a little bit about that, but I think that's going to really get us into the weeds. And I encourage all parents to, read this book, because you will be able to get a really good sense of what's going on with the politics. But my head was spinning when I was reading that chapter. I was like, my goodness, this is a lot. That being said, what do you want parents to know or understand about the politics around children's food?
Well, I think what I'd like them to realize is the status quo does not have to be this way. I'll give you an example. So as I said, right now, companies collectively are spending about $2 billion a year to market very aggressively their products just to your children. That's on top of the billions they're spending to advertise to the rest of us. And when we look at the actual products that they are promoting to our children, they are almost uniformly unhealthy. Only a tiny fraction are what we would consider healthy foods. And we also know that marketing is very, very powerful, and it does shape children's food preferences. And our federal government long ago, as early as I think 2006, concluded this kind of marketing is playing a role in childhood obesity. So that's that, but it's something that we're also used to. We grew up on Saturday morning cartoons with ads for sugary cereal. Like, we just sort of assume that it's the norm that our kids should be marketed to, they should pester us, and then we have to say no. And so just to give you an example of how politics can change that status quo, in Chile, about a year ago, 2 years ago, they passed legislation that prevents that. And so now it's down to this level. If you look at a box of Frosted Flakes in Chile, they're not allowed to put Tony the Tiger on that box. Like, they've taken it to that level. We don't even want cartoon characters on the box, let alone advertising to our children. And so that's just an example of, if we had the collective will of parents to say, enough, we don't, why are we putting corporations ahead of our children's health? If we really truly banded together and pressured our elected officials to change that, we could. Those are the sorts of things I would love parents to think about. I know they're busy managing their day-to-day, and I try to help them with that too, but kind of on a higher level, we really could use our political system to shape this system for the better.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I think there is some food marketing agreement amongst corporations, but I believe it's a voluntary agreement, and I don't think it's really moved the needle. And I believe that was put into place like back in 2010 or 12, quite a while ago.
Exactly. It's about 10 years old. It's called the Children's Food and Beverage Advertising Initiative, SCFBAI. And I don't want to say there have been no improvements in terms of, the industry's practices with marketing to children, but I would say they're extremely modest. And the reason is these are for-profit industries, and they'll only go as far voluntarily as they can without cutting into their profits. And to truly clean up the marketing of foods and beverages to children, there's no question we have to have real regulation. It cannot leave it to them. The fox can't guard the hen house, as they say.
And so why do you think there's no real regulation behind this?
It's entirely due, I think, to food and beverage industry lobbying and the incredible power they have in our federal government. Just to give you this example that absolutely blew my mind. In 2011, many parents may not even be aware that this went down, but this was during the Obama administration. 4 federal agencies got together and wanted to issue purely voluntary guidelines for advertising foods and drinks to children. So no one was going to have to comply, but they wanted a federal scheme of voluntary guidelines. And that effort was completely crushed by the food and beverage industries, just absolutely went nowhere. And later, Reuters did a report to try to figure out sort of what happened. And they had this statistic that just I found so troubling and so shocking. And it's this. The Center for Science and the Public Interest, which was one of the lead public health organizations pushing for the guidelines, spent $70,000 that year on all of their lobbying, not just for these guidelines, but for anything else they were lobbying for, $70,000.
Wow.
And according to Reuters, the food and beverage industries spent that amount every 13 hours that year.
Oh, wow.
So that just shows you how outgunned, we are in these efforts.
Yeah.
But call me naive. If parents on both sides of the aisle made clear to their elected officials, we really care about this issue, we would vote on this issue, then I think you'd see that lobbying power greatly diminish.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. That's really interesting. You talk about food everywhere and how just one treat is never just one treat. And then you lead into the weight problems of kids in our country. And food as one of the key underpinnings, which I wholeheartedly agree with you. And I think everybody out there would agree with you. I think it's a multivariate, and I'm sure you agree with that as well. There are lots of underpinnings to this issue. When we talk about kids' food, though, what are you finding from the research around weight problems in children and the singular role of kids' food?
I think there are a lot of strands in your question. I mean, there is this issue of treating children. I think we now live in a society in which, kids are just sort of quote unquote treated constantly, and such that it's no longer a treat anymore. I think most parents would agree with that. And I even have a chapter in the book called Just One Treat, where I take a hypothetical child through her day and I show parents, each, not that they need to hear it from me because I think they're all too familiar, but showing them each opportunity in a child's day where an adult is offering or plying a child with unhealthy food, but for very different reasons. Like sometimes it might be the PTA holding a donut fundraiser because schools are underfunded and there's a huge loophole in the laws surrounding junk food fundraising. So I want to give you like a little education at each juncture in the child's day. Maybe it's soccer snacks, maybe it's, the grandparents, whatever. But I do think that plays a huge role, because what I found in doing that chapter is that at the end of the day, that hypothetical child could have had something like 18 to 25 teaspoons of sugar just from treats, having nothing to do with the sugar she ate in her meals, the dessert you wanted to give her at home, all of that. So that's a huge issue. And yes, speaking of kid food specifically, the universe of foods that we as a society seem to have agreed on as quote unquote kid food, there's certainly a few healthy spots like applesauce and, milk and baby carrots. But for the most part, we're talking about hyper palatable and often sugar sweetened foods that absolutely, play a role in excess calories in children's diets for sure.
Mm-hmm. It's really, really hard for parents to navigate this one. Do you find that?
Yes, absolutely. Because as I say in the book, we're okay with treats in our child's life. It's just that they start to stack up so dramatically that it really does start to feel like a deluge. It did for me. And that was actually one of the motivations for starting the lunch tray, was this feeling of like, am I alone in feeling like my kid's just getting deluged with junk food outside my home? in ways that actually are inhibiting me from offering treats in my home, which is a very sad thing, you know?
Yeah. I used to work quite intensively with children who were struggling with weight problems and helping the family get, a healthier balance in their day to day. I've never been somebody who would say, take all the sweets and the sugar away. I just don't feel like that works very well, but rather helping parents and the kids navigate. But I can tell you so many times I would hear, families doing so well at home and then come in and say, we are rock solid at home, but every time my child walks out the door, I cannot predict what they're going to be offered. I cannot, it's not fair to make him say no all the time. I mean, it's very complicated.
Right. And that's actually, you kind of put your finger on why I wrote Kid Food, because as I said, I don't just take you through the child's day and lament, oh, isn't it horrible that they're getting junk at all these junctures. At each juncture, it's only a paragraph or two for each thing. I go a little deeper to show you what is really going on, because that's the fulcrum where we could make some change. In other words, I agree with you. I don't think it's fair to say to your child, everyone else is getting Gatorade and the Rice Krispie treat at soccer and you can't have it. I mean, you can do that with your child, but I think that is hard to do, and certainly hard to do on a regular basis. But I present, in that particular paragraph, research that shows that if the soccer coach is willing to issue a policy, parents will very quickly fall in line. They're not wedded to that. It's just they need to have a higher authority tell them what to do, and then they'll do it. So there's a point where we could try to foster some change. And similarly, junk food fundraising, I tell you about the regulations and the loopholes so that we could see, well, here's how we could change things with our wellness policy at school. So, because I think that if we can't change the cultural factors and the legal framework, it is very hard to put this burden on parents, individually, and children individually.
Mm-hmm. It's such a magnitude of issues. What do you feel is a solution to all of this?
I think, as I say at the end of the book, it is such an enormous problem, but the magnitude of the problem, instead of making us want to throw up our hands, let's look at the silver lining, which is that gives every one of us a role to play. And it can be something very small, like, first of all, it can be things we do in our own homes, and I hope the book is helpful to parents in that regard. But if we want to step outside our home and engage in little forms of advocacy, it could be as simple as, asking the principal, hey, could we just have all the birthday celebrations on one day a month? We're not saying to get rid of the cupcakes, but why don't we just bring in one set of cupcakes for all the November birthdays? Like, that small change alone really can make a difference. And then, for parents and other readers who want to get fired up and engage in much more broad-based advocacy, I offer all the tools for that as well. Because I think that's the point. We can't wave a magic wand and fix the whole thing at once, but there are lots of different roles for all of us to play, from in our homes to the ballot box.
Yeah. And you do a great job. I think you had 14 different tips for taking action. One of the things I'm always, I co-wrote the book Fearless Feeding. So, this whole idea of making food something fearful to children or to parents, how do we deal with kid food without creating more fear around food?
Right. And this is one of those areas where I turn to you, Jill, and say, you help me. How do I verbalize this with my child so I'm not creating weird taboos or creating pressures that could lead to eating disorders or anything like that? But my general sense, and I think you'd probably agree, is I think we just need to give kids the understanding that the baseline of their diet, the day-to-day, the meal-to-meal should be healthy. And that there's certainly room for treats, of course. And that's a delicious and enjoyable and celebratory part of life. But, through whatever means we do that, and obviously a lot depends on children's ages, but, it can be anything from that red, green, yellow, traffic light system to explain to a young child, these are the green growing foods we can eat all the time. But when it comes to these red foods, this is something we save for special occasions. I think however you feel is best for your child and your family, and with the advice of people like you, I think we do need to give kids those tools, because we are raising children today in a food environment that I think quite fairly can be called toxic. It is leading to disease, obesity, children with shorter lifespans than their parents. I think it's not inflammatory to call it toxic. And so we have to arm our children with tools to navigate it in ways that don't demonize food, but educate them.
Mm-hmm. And I think, your book does a fine job of really laying everything out for parents to really understand, why it is so hard. So it's not you, mom or dad. It's, you've got to understand the environment that your child is growing up in terms of food and the culture around it. But also, it is up to you to create that environment that you want for your child and advocate for the bigger picture that need to be in place in order to support the parents out there who are trying to navigate all of this.
Exactly. Like right now, we live in a culture which not only doesn't support parents in the very basic and critical goal of raising healthy eaters, I would say almost everything in our society undermines parents. And that's really what I'm getting at in the book. Like, let's look at that in each context. And it's not always big food at work. I'm not always demonizing food companies. I used to work for one. Sometimes it's cultural issues. Sometimes it's things you don't even think about. Like, why are the PTA putting out donuts? Well, it's because your state hasn't adequately funded your school system and they need money for the field trip, so sometimes it's factors like that. And so that's my goal, is to sort of shine light on all of these different issues and then help parents navigate it.
You asked a question at the beginning of the book, and I want to turn that question back on you now. What would our kids' world look like if we actually voted on issues like this or held politicians, food corporations, or others involved in this kid food dilemma accountable?
I believe it would look a whole lot better. I really do, because right now we live in a society in which the interests of corporations do seem to come ahead of those of our children and really all of our collective health. And I think, the example I gave earlier in our conversation of what's going on in Chile is a great example of, if we voted on these issues, if we held our politicians accountable, that's a remarkable change. And I should mention, it goes well beyond just bans on marketing to children. They also have this very unbelievably clear, accessible front of package warning system that I just learned in a book event I did, that it was actually developed so that it would be understandable to people as young as age 3. Mm. And it's little black stop signs that appear on the fronts of packages so that you can get, in a very quick snapshot, you can understand the healthfulness or lack thereof of a particular product. Just something like that would help parents navigate this current morass of the kinds of claims we were talking about earlier, in this podcast. So those are examples of, wow, their food environment just changed for the better. And data is showing that even though these changes were just adopted, they are actually changing people's purchasing behavior, which is amazing.
I imagine this book will stir things up for you a bit in terms of big food.
Well, it's interesting. Not yet. I haven't heard anything yet, and I'm waiting. And, and we'll see. We'll see. I mean, I would love to have that dialogue, because again, I've seen it from both sides. I didn't mention this at the outset, but like your husband, I was involved in marketing because I was the lawyer signing off on marketing claims and advertising and labeling. So I really have seen this from both sides, very much so. And, I do think consumer demand plays a role here too, I think we were already seeing this to a degree, like cleaner labels, more transparency. That is driven by consumer demand. So maybe my book can stimulate, more demand in the right direction. That would be lovely.
What motivates your activism?
I think it really started when I became a mom. That really changed my view of our food culture and food system, because just as we were talking about, I started to realize, wow, this is so much harder than I thought it would be to raise healthy eaters. I just didn't think that would be a challenging part of parenting. And it really was. And then I realized, here I am with nutrition education, higher education, resources, food access. I can go to my Whole Foods and buy what I want. And that's so not true for so many millions of families in this country. And so I think that's what led to my broader activism. I have all these advantages and I'm finding it hard. We really need to work together to make this easier for all families across the board.
Amen. Last question for you. What does it mean to be nourished?
Oh, that's such a good question. I would say to be nourished is to be fed healthy, delicious food that, promotes growth and offered with love.
Thank you, Bettina. It's such a pleasure to have you on the show. And for everybody out there listening, her book, Kid Food, The Challenge of Feeding Children in a Highly Processed World, is available on Amazon and at all bookstores.
Yes, I hope. Certainly online, if not in the store itself.
Okay, I'll include all those links. And thanks again so much, Bettina. I know you're really busy and I appreciate you sharing all your knowledge and expertise.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I love this conversation. Really, thank you.
Well, there you have it, folks. When I finished this interview, my head was spinning in a good way. I've always recognized what parents are up against. Marianne and I cover quite a bit of the obstacles in our book, Fearless Feeding, but the food obstacles alone are a lot and can be quite shocking. So if you're feeling a little overwhelmed, I get it, but I do want to encourage you to take a look at the book and read it. Towards the end of the book, she has a lot of helpful information about becoming an advocate for your child, becoming an advocate for better food for kids. I encourage each of you to advocate in whatever way suits you, within your own home, at school, in your religious gathering places, or even on Capitol Hill if you are so moved to do so. If we want things to change, to be easier, for food to be better for our kids, we have to speak up, and not just with complaints, with thoughtful, action-oriented suggestions. So you'll find the show notes over at jillcastle.com/098. You'll also find Bettina's link to her book, Kid Food, as well as some related articles on the topic that we discussed today. And as I mentioned, her book is available on Amazon. If you're not subscribed to this show, head over to iTunes or any app that you listen to podcasts on and hit the subscribe button. That way you'll get my new shows every time they release. While you're there, why don't you take a moment to rate or review the show? When you do so, it really helps other parents find the nourished child. Thanks to all of you who have already taken the time to subscribe, rate, and review the show. Up next on The Nourished Child, I'm talking about 10 ways to kick off your best food parenting year ever. So stay tuned. Thanks for joining me today. It warms my heart to know that somehow this little podcast is helping you and your family. So be sure to give that kid in your life a loving squeeze today. Bye for now.
Thanks for listening to the Nourished Child podcast, where the #1 goal is to help you grow a nourished child inside and out.